Okay, here we go. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whenever you're watching this. Thanks for joining us again for another edition of Rereading Together. This is a conversation between two of us today, but it might be more than two of us sometimes, a conversation about Scripture. We hope to at some point make you laugh, make you cry, make you wonder, make you think about Scripture. And the format we've been taking for these sessions is we're reading through an entire book of the Bible, and then we're discussing it with some fun categories along the way. And we hope that you have some fun listening to it. We have fun talking about it. The goal is to interpret in community. So we're bouncing ideas off of one another. Today I'm joined by a special guest. This is not Jordan Smith. This is Megan Alsing. And Megan is doing her apprenticeships with the PBA MDiv program here at Memorial. She's been involved with the women's groups and involved with Sunday services and some other things as well in the Memorial community. And I'm really glad to be joined by Megan. Megan is more of an Old Testament expert than I am, and we're turning to an Old Testament book today. So I'm really glad that Megan is joining us. We're going to be tackling, thank you so much, Megan. We're going to be tackling the book of Ruth. So we at least didn't start with Isaiah, where we had to read 66 chapters all at once. We started with one of the shorter Old Testament books, but a super interesting book. Mm-hmm. I love the book of Ruth, and I love that, kind of my overall impressions as we're getting into it. I love that Ruth is like a cool story, like it's an interesting story in and of itself. But as you start to get into the details, it becomes like very complex and rich and just really interesting to me. And I realize the more I get into the book of Ruth, the less I understand about the cultural context and about what's really going on in this story and some things like that. So that's kind of my impressions. What were your impressions of reading Ruth start to finish?
Yeah, it's really interesting in the English Bible how it's right after Judges. We have all of this mayhem in Judges where everyone seems like they turn into a bad guy, and there's so much...
We'll probably never do Judges because Judges is crazy.
It's kind of scary as you read it. And
there's
so much violence and there's so much bloodshed. And then you come to Ruth and you're like, wow, there's no violence. No one's really a bad guy. Maybe the other redeemer who doesn't redeem, maybe he's less good than Boaz, but he's not bad.
Yeah.
And maybe Orpah, who goes home instead of follows like Ruth, maybe she's less good than Ruth. But there's no bad guy in this story. And so it's really interesting coming off of Judges just to see that contrast. It's a happy story.
Yeah.
And the whole thing is kind of almost ideal. And yet somehow it still has a plot, which is interesting. It's one of those stories where it can be like all about good people and still have a good plot.
Yeah, it's a comedy in the Greek sense of like comedy versus tragedy. It has a happy ending, which is maybe not what we'd expect for a story set in the time of the Judges.
Yeah.
So the first verse we get in Ruth sets this story in the time of the Judges. Scholars argue about what's really going on here, but at least the story world is supposed to be set there. And so as readers, our expectation might be a Judges type of story, as you said, but we don't get a Judges type of story. We get a happy story, which is really cool.
Instead of where in the Judges, you say that last verse of Judges in chapter 21, verse 25, in those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. And so that kind of describes the chaos of Judges, is that everyone's doing as they see fit, and those are bad things. Whereas we come into Ruth, and it's supposedly set in that same scene, and yet everyone's doing as they see fit, and it's good things. Suddenly, they're taking care of the poor. And they're letting in this Moabite woman and welcoming her into community. And all of these different things. It's just so different. Yeah,
that's so good. All right, so let's get into our categories. As I said, we jump into some fun categories here and try to have a conversation about the whole book in the process. So the first category we have, we call The Past is the Past. What do you think, Megan, is the bit of background information that we really need to have in order to understand what's going on in Ruth?
Yeah, so the thing that I put down as the necessary background information is to know a little bit about how the Israelites would have viewed the Moabites.
Okay.
Because over and over and over and over again, this book is like Ruth the Moabite. She was from Moab. Ruth the Moabitess, like over and over again. And just to have a little context for just how poorly Israel would have looked upon the Moabites. So to know a little bit about Moab, you have to go way back to Genesis, pretty early on, and know that the Moabites are actually descendants of Lot, who is Abraham's cousin. And so Lot part ways with Abraham, and he goes and lives in Sodom and Gomorrah, and his wife, turns back and becomes a pillar of salt.
Yep.
And so where we get to the weird part of the story is where Lot's two daughters are like, well, we're living in the middle of nowhere by ourselves with our dad, and so we want our family line to continue. And so they have this incestuous relationship with their father, and that's where the Moabites come from, from one of those daughters of Lot, and Lot himself. And so the Israelites think Moabites are kind of the worst. They just have this view of them as the lowest of the low because they're the seed of this incestuous relationship, and so they do not like Moab. They're at war with Moab oftentimes, and the Moabites are really just bad. And so that Ruth is a Moabite, and that Ruth is a Moabite who is the great-grandmother of King David.
Yes.
Those are kind of really big aspects of the story that we need to get to know, be familiar with.
Yeah, that's good. And you came on to the one that I was going to mention as well, which is the connection to King David. So it sort of skips to the end of the Ruth story, but as we come to the end of chapter 4 in Ruth, we find out that at least one of the main points of telling this story is to connect genealogically this story to King David. So we get a preservation of the line of David kind of idea at the end of Ruth. And so that maybe helps us a little bit to see this isn't just about telling a story set in the time of Judges that's happy as opposed to all the other stories in Judges. That might be a point as well, but maybe the central thing going on here is to get us to David. And then canonically, we're going to jump into 1 Samuel. We're going to go on to learn a lot about David and how important David is in the story of Israel. So it's about connecting it to King David. And this story plays a crucial role in that, genealogically.
Yeah, that's really important.
Good. All right, so our next category is Tweet It. Megan, best quip in this book. Less than 280 characters. Might be a verse, might be a phrase. What have you got?
Yeah, so I picked out kind of maybe the obvious one of 1:16, where you go, I'll go, and where you stay, I'll stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God.
That's good.
It's just so poetic that it's a really easy one to go to, and it just rolls off the tongue, I feel like. Where you'll go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay.
For sure. I think we'll return to 1:16 to 18 a couple of times in this conversation. The one that I picked out was chapter 2, verse 12.
Okay.
And it says, it's Boaz speaking to Ruth, and he says, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." This play on language with wings shows up a couple of times in Ruth, and we'll maybe get to that in a minute. But again, I love the... maybe this is some of my background bringing to Ruth, but when I heard Ruth talked about in churches, a lot of times the focus was on Boaz. And how good it is that Boaz is the guardian redeemer, the kinsman redeemer, and Boaz is such a good guy, in this story, and he takes care of Naomi and Ruth. If we read the story closely, it's Naomi and Ruth who take all the initiative in this story.
Ruth takes care of Naomi and Ruth.
Yeah.
And Naomi.
That's right. Ruth takes care of Naomi and Ruth. And Ruth chases after Boaz in a certain sense. Naomi instructs Ruth to chase after Boaz. But all of this is going on where the initiative is actually taken by the women in the story. And Boaz is kind of put in a position of either Boaz, you're going to be a really terrible guy and we're going to hate you in this story, or you're going to do what we all think you're going to do. It's not that Boaz, and so I love this verse here in 2:12 where Boaz is recognizing that it's Ruth who has taken this initiative and she's done a good thing, and he speaks a blessing of the Lord and asks God to repay Ruth for doing this great thing, of taking the initiative of doing what she's done. So I love that.
I feel like Naomi, in some ways, is the mastermind. One of the things that I find really interesting about chapter 3 is that Naomi gives Ruth these instructions of like, you need to do this, and like, go do this and talk to Boaz. Get yourself ready, go talk to Boaz.
Yeah.
And so Ruth says this line, I will do whatever you say.
Yes.
And then Ruth goes to Boaz and says this and this and this, and you need to do this, and this is how it's going to turn out. And Boaz then says, I will do whatever you say.
Yeah.
And it's just so interesting how that line of command is so different than you might expect.
Yeah.
Where Naomi says to Ruth, and Ruth says to Boaz.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, that's great. Okay, our next category is called fish out of water. So this is the verse or the passage or the theme maybe in Ruth that is most taken out of context or most misquoted or something like that. What do you think?
Yeah, so I actually choose the same thing as I said for my tweet, but I say it because it's so catchy that we almost forget it's here. Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay. There's that one song by Chris Tomlin that has that verse in it.
Okay.
I can't remember.
I don't
what
know
it's
that
called.
I know it.
Oh, where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay.
Yes.
So, and I feel like we always think of it as like something that someone in the Bible said to God. And so when you put it in the context and it's Ruth to Naomi, like it takes on a different flavor. And so I guess that's why I picked it as the misquoted verse, is because we can easily forget where it comes from and what it's doing in the context.
Yeah. I picked the exact same one, 16 to 18. Let me read all three of those verses because they're just really interesting. But Ruth replied to Naomi, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." And then when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her by saying this little poetic thing that she said, she stopped urging her to leave. So I picked out the same passage because I've been at a couple of weddings where this was used, where this passage was used, which was really interesting because as someone who is, fancies themselves a biblical scholar, at least on some level, I was like, I know where that passage is from. This is not a wedding passage. It's not a love passage, or it's not a romantic love passage is what I mean to say. It's a different kind of love and commitment that Ruth is demonstrating to Naomi, and in some ways I don't know what the right word is, scandalous almost kind of commitment. Like Ruth should have done the sensible thing that Orpah does. Orpah's not bad, as you said. Orpah's just sensible. She's like, I've got no prospects if I stay with Naomi. That's a death sentence. That's a poverty sentence. I'm going to go back to my people and someone will take me in. So Orpah does the sensible thing. Ruth is unsensible here. And so, I've heard it actually in a couple of weddings where it was used as a reading of like, this is what these two people are saying to each other. And I'm like, it works as a commitment statement. If you and your husband, you and your wife want to say this to each other, then you could talk about making that kind of commitment. I'm not actually opposed to that, but it's ripped out of context. And we often then miss that it's Ruth, a foreign woman who should have been disdained, saying to Naomi, I'm going to stay with you even though it means poverty, even though it means all of this hardship.
And that she's going to take care of her. I think that's part of kind of the almost covenant that she's making with Naomi. Is that I'm going to help you. I'm not just going to stay, I'm going to help.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, our next category is ancient connection. What do you think would be one of the main takeaways that the people of Israel would have had in reading, in hearing this book?
Yeah, so kind of what I was thinking is that in its placement coming after Judges, and kind of in its setting, that maybe the main point for Israel is like, this is what it means to live rightly as Israel. Okay. That you are supposed to be caring for the poor. You're supposed to be, having this kinsman redeemer process going on. You're supposed to be having, the gleaning where they leave some barley for Ruth. Like, that's a big deal to leave some of your grain behind for the poor.
Yeah.
And then also that, they're welcoming in the foreigner. There's some idea that this was probably written later rather than earlier. Right. And some people say that maybe it's a way of maybe countering or tempering some of what Ezra and Nehemiah say about, okay. Ezra and Nehemiah say you should, all of the intermarriage is bad. It's just bad. And there's no other way to look at it. And maybe Ruth is a way of then tempering that and saying, well, but there are the noble foreigners, and there are the people who have come into covenant with the Lord, and there are people who, as Boaz says to Ruth, like, you've come under Yahweh's wing. Right. And there are those people that they should be welcomed in. So it's not to say that that it's a matter of faith, not a matter of race, almost. To say you're a Moabite, therefore you're bad. Well, you're a Moabite, but you're coming under the wing of the Lord, and you're coming to follow the Lord. So it's kind of presenting an ideal picture of what it means to kind of live rightly as Israel.
I love that. I think that's good. My kind of ancient connection was going back to the initiative that's shown by women in this story. And I think in the 21st century, we maybe don't hear that as quite as like crazy, affronting or crazy as I think the ancient audience would have heard it. The people of Israel would have, I don't know if shocked is the right word, but like it would have been surprising that all of the initiative and the action that's sort of taken in this story is taken by Naomi and Ruth, and Boaz ends up as a responsive character, a passive character. He's just doing what
they wanted him to.
They wanted him to. Yeah, exactly. So he doesn't come off as this like heroic figure if you're reading the story. You could preach it that way. I've heard it preached that way, unfortunately. But I don't think that's what's going on in the story. The heroes, the heroines, are Naomi and Ruth. They're taking all the initiative. And I think that would have been so surprising to the ancient audience to hear that. Maybe in a similar way as it would have been surprising in the book of Judges to read about Deborah. Like that we just have a sort of flipping of our expectations in how this story ought to go. And I think that's really interesting with this bit about Ruth and Naomi taking initiative. One of the things that I think is most interesting about the initiative taking is that play on words with wings. Because you brought up just a second ago from 2:12 where Boaz says, the God of Israel, you should be rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. So Boaz, in a sense, is saying, like, God's going to take care of you, and you've come under Yahweh's protection. That's an important statement in terms of her being a Moabitess. But then in chapter 3, we've got this, I will use the word scandalous now, situation at the threshing floor where Ruth actually turns that language back on Boaz. And she lays down at his feet. Again, there's a lot of euphemism in chapter 3, and it's hard to know, especially as English readers, what exactly is going on here. But Ruth asks Boaz to spread, our translation is the corner of your garment. But the Hebrew there is the wings language. It's something about put your wings over me, shelter me under your wings kind of idea. And there's an implication or a sense here where Boaz is going, you're taking shelter under God's wing, and Ruth is kind of turning it around and saying, why don't you let God use your wing? And that kind of initiative, I think, again, would have been so surprising to hear as the ancient audience. And even to connect it to the contemporary audience, us, it's hard for us to hear it because we don't catch it in the words always.
And it's not entirely unprecedented in the Old Testament too. And I think there are connections throughout Ruth to make us think of other characters like Tamar or like, Lot's daughters, where someone is taking an initiative that you wouldn't expect would take initiative.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of tied throughout is these heroines, these female characters, they're all tied together within the Old Testament narrative, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I agree. That's great. Okay, contemporary connection then. What do you think is a takeaway that we should have as the 21st century church?
Yeah, so one of the things that I was thinking about as a potential takeaway for us is just this idea that God is the provider, that even though we have so much of Ruth's initiative, again, she has come under God's wing.
Yes.
And that even though God isn't a major player in that he doesn't speak, there's so much of God's providence just flowing throughout the narrative. Where Naomi hears that, heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them. And so then Naomi comes back to the land. And then God is just kind of working through this whole narrative and weaving it together, such that Naomi, who called herself bitter, is able at the end to kind of take up her name again and to be happy. And so kind of in the midst of even the work and initiative they're doing, and even in the suffering and the bitterness, that God is kind of working and moving his hand in all of that. And I think it's easy for us as Christians today to not even think about that on a daily basis, to not think about the ways that God is providentially moving. Often it's easier to think about our own initiative, how we've done this for ourselves and how we've worked ourselves up the ladder. But to think about the fact that the Lord is orchestrating the circumstances and that his providential hand is working in all that it's not us, but that God has control.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks, Megan. My contemporary connection, I want to go to the bit you were just referencing at the end of chapter 1, where Naomi and Ruth come back to the land because Naomi has heard that there is food now, the famine has ended. And as they return, the people there don't recognize her, don't welcome her back. Something's going on here. The words we get in the text are can this be Naomi? Again, maybe they don't recognize her because she's gotten older. That's like a simple explanation. But it's also, there's a sort of sense of kind of a stopping or an exclusion. Like, are you sure you belong here? Is at least kind of the inference I get from that. And Naomi sort of recognizes that something is different about herself. And this lament that she speaks, I think, ought to connect with us as a contemporary audience. She says in verse 20 of chapter 1, "Don't call me Naomi," her name which means pleasant. She told them, "Call me Mara," a name that means bitterness, as you mentioned, "because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me pleasant? Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." We get this kind of lament in the Psalms. We get this kind of lament in Lamentations, of course. But to see it here in story form is a little bit different. It's not in the poetry of the Psalms. It's not in response to the destruction of Jerusalem in Lamentations. It's not even Jesus on the cross. Like we get suffering from Jesus and him responding with the lament, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is in the midst of a story world where Naomi is like changing her identity a little bit for these people and demonstrating that by saying, "I went away full and the Lord has brought me back empty." From her perspective, God has tipped her life on its head, and she is now coming back as someone who is a different person. And in the circumstances of our lives, there are things that happen to us sometimes where it's like, there was my life before this thing, and there was my life after. It might be the loss of someone, like 2 sons and a husband, or whoever you're losing in a certain situation where it's like, my life is different. I am a different person now. And being able to articulate that in this way, and then in the Psalms and in Lamentations, we get this exemplified for us of we can even speak this way to God. Naomi's not speaking to God here, but we get that modeled for us in the Psalms, of saying this sort of expression from our human perspective is good and okay to bring before God. And I think that reminder is helpful for us as contemporary Christians.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's something interesting about, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like this is the only time where someone changes their name or says they're going to change their name to something that's worse. Like it's interesting throughout so many of the scriptures. There are name changes, and they're like heightening, they're
Abraham
bettering.
And Sarah.
Yeah. Jacob to Israel, and all of these different name changes where it's kind of like from this level to like, whoa, you're better.
And usually it's God who does it.
And usually it's God who does it. But here it's her saying it of herself, and it's lesser, that's really interesting. So I'm glad you brought up that point.
Yeah, no, that is really good. Okay, our last two categories. First is phone a friend. Which friend are you phoning today, Megan?
Yeah, so one of the commentaries I had a chance to thumb through was by Kenneth Way, and it's in the Teach the Text commentary series.
Okay.
And he just had a really interesting point about maybe kind of connecting this with Luke 10 and the story of the Good Samaritan.
Oh, okay.
And so he kind of talked about how if we kind of read this in referencing the Good Samaritan story in our heads, it can help us to think about the fact that sometimes outsiders are able to model godly qualities better than insiders. And that on account of that, we should be more open to learning from other people, even if they're not Christians, when they have really godly qualities about them. And so I've found that really fascinating that he would connect those two texts. And one of the things that I was thinking of was relationships that I've made with Arab Muslims, and some of the ways where they have really challenged me in my own Christian faith by their Islamic faith. Just ways in which they practice enormous hospitality and enormous generosity, and I don't do that very well. And American society often doesn't do that as well as an Arab society. And so just thinking about how I can be humble enough to learn, even from maybe people who aren't Christians but who have really Christian-like qualities about them. So I thought that was really helpful.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And I mean, I'm glad you brought up hospitality, because there's a theme of hospitality running through Ruth that is really interesting. If we just kind of put on a lens of looking for that theme, it is really interesting what's happening with hospitality in the book of Ruth. Okay, I was a little cheeky today.
Okay.
I phoned my wife.
Oh, no.
So my phone a friend is Dr. Brittany Melton. She has, so her dissertation was partly on Ruth, among a few other books, and she has lots of good insights, at least in my opinion, on the book of Ruth. One of the things that she was telling me as we were talking about Ruth was this scene at the threshing floor in chapter 3, which is sort of scandalous, and there's like this question of, do Ruth and Boaz have sex? Is there, like, what's going on exactly at the threshing floor? What's it mean to uncover a man's feet? Like, all these things are kind of confusing, and there's obviously cultural things that are going on that we don't understand as 21st century Americans. But one of the insights Brittany said was it's an emphasis which we see throughout the Old Testament where there is more priority put on justice than on piety. So it's not to say that piety is ignored in the Old Testament by any means, but in this scene in the threshing floor, there's this idea of like, is someone going to find Ruth at the threshing floor, and like, what kind of scandal is that going to create? What kind of thing is it going to do to Boaz's reputation or to Ruth's reputation or whatever? And the emphasis of this part of the story is on whether or not Boaz will extend his wing over Ruth and care for her, be the guardian redeemer. That's kind of the question, is the justice question, rather than the like, who's had sex with who sort of piety question, which was really interesting to me. Again, just like, of all the things that are going on in this story, which could strike us as scandalous, Brittany's saying, like, hear the justice theme that's running throughout it of how can Naomi, this woman who is now empty and has nothing, how can she be cared for? Well, it's through Ruth. Okay, how can Ruth be cared for? Because she doesn't have a husband and no prospect for a husband except through this idea of a guardian, kinsman, redeemer. And so will Ruth be taken care of? Like, will there be justice in this situation that will lift these two women out of poverty, out of emptiness, and restore them? And I love that that's the emphasis of this story, and it's not the sort of piety question, which we sometimes get wrong in the 21st century. I think we tip that the other way. We focus on piety more than justice. So I thought that was really interesting.
Another way you can see that is just even in the treatment of a Moabite, is that there's less concern about she's a Moabite, and so there's almost this piety question of Israelites and Moabites don't get along.
Yes.
And they are bad in almost like a theological sense because they came out of incest. Yeah. And so, but instead there's a justice theme running through of Ruth is being welcomed and Boaz is feeding her and being hospitable to her. And so, I think you can see that in other areas. I think chapter 3 is a really good place for it, but then it's also throughout.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, last one is MVP. What do you think is the most valuable passage in Ruth?
Yeah, so I actually chose the one that you said for the tweet.
Okay.
So I thought the most valuable passage was kind of chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother in your homeland, and you came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." And I guess I thought it was the most valuable passage because it kind of encapsulates the whole story in some sense in those verses. And also there's a linguistic, like a verbal connection between this and Abraham. Okay. Where Abraham also left his father and mother in his homeland. And so kind of this connection between Ruth, this Moabite, who is kind of almost a secondary figure to Abraham, the original Israelite, in a way. And so I just thought that was a really important passage to encapsulate what's happening and also to tie her back to a really important figure.
Yeah. That's good. I like that. So I'm returning to your tweet, which is 1:16-18. Okay. It's the passage we've read already. Ruth's poetic response to Naomi saying that I won't leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I will stay. I think in reaction to the emphasis I heard as a child and growing up in youth group and such, emphasis on Boaz in this story, I think in reaction to that, I just love the richness of the relationship between Naomi and Ruth and what the dynamic that's going on between them throughout this story, but I think that's encapsulated in chapter 1, verses 16-18. And it is beautiful and poetic and rolls off the tongue, like you said. So it's really nice in that sense as well. All right, that's it for us. Anything else you want to add on the book of Ruth? Anything we didn't hit?
No, I just think it's a really quick read, an easy story to get into, and so definitely go and take some time to read it.
Yeah, don't just read chapter 1. Yeah, don't just read chapter 1. Don't just read the MVP. Read all the way through the 4 chapters. It won't take that long, and it is a beautiful story with a lot of richness.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks for joining me today, Megan.
Of course, good to be
here. Really appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us. We will see you next week. Don't know what book we're going to do next week, but we'll be back with you. Thanks.